Welcome to Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology, our series of lectures on the urinary system. So in the past couple lectures we've talked about how urine is formed, and so now let's talk a little specifically about the characteristics of urine, and then we'll look at its pathway until it is ejected out of the body. So first of all, your body is constantly producing urine. As the blood's flowing around the body, it's being filtered through the kidneys, and so you're constantly producing urine. In about 24 hours, anywhere from about 1 to 1.8 liters of urine are produced. And this is an important thing to remember, that the urine and the filtrate are different things. So remember back to the filtrate, that is what is first being filtered out of the blood. So as the blood is coming into the kidneys, going into those nephrons, everything is pulled out of the blood. That is called the filtrate. And that filtrate contains pretty much everything in the blood except the blood cells themselves and proteins. Urine, on the other hand, this is what remains after it's gone clear through the nephron, after we've taken back everything that we don't want to lose, and we've added some things that we do want to get rid of. Then we finally produce that urine. So urine and the filtrate are very different. The urine has a yellow color, and that comes from a pigment called urochrome, and that comes from the breakdown of hemoglobin and some other solutes. And urine, when it's initially produced, is sterile, but once it's passed, it doesn't stay sterile very long. But initially it is sterile, slightly aromatic, and it is slightly acidic as well. And this is both a function of what is in the urine, but also to help keep it sterile, it's going to be slightly acidic. And then there's something called specific gravity. And this tells you, it's basically the density of the urine, and it's just slightly above that of water. So water has a specific gravity of 1.0. Urine is anywhere from 1.001 to 1.035, so just barely higher than water itself. Here's just some of the things that you want to find in your urine. Sodium and potassium ions. So in a minute here we're going to talk about electrolyte balance. One of the main functions of the kidneys is homeostatic balance of the ions in the body, and so sodium and potassium are released from the body to keep those ions in balance. Urea again comes from the breakdown of uric acid come from the breakdown of amino acids, and then creatinine comes from aerobic respiration as well. There's also ammonia and bicarbonate ions. Bicarbonate is something else we're going to talk about here in just a little bit when we're talking about acid-base balance. So the urine, the kidneys also function in balancing the acidity of the fluids in the body, and so by releasing bicarbonate ions we can manage that system as well. Things we don't want to find in the urine, just things we do not want to find in the urine, and this would be things such as glucose. Glucose is found in the filtrate. Again, we have this difference between urine and filtrate. Glucose is found in the filtrate, but we don't want to find it in the end product in the urine. If you do find glucose, if you find any of these things in the blood, in the urine, there is a reason, and it could possibly be a problem. So glucose, if you're finding glucose in the urine, that means that your body's not absorbing it. You're ending up with more glucose than can be reabsorbed from the urine, and so that may mean that you have diabetes mellitus. Blood proteins, again, those are things that initially don't go into the filtrate even, and so if you have blood proteins, red blood cells, hemoglobin, or white blood cells in your urine, that's going to point to some sort of problem. White blood cells Red blood cells could possibly be a urinary tract infection, some sort of infection happening inside the urinary tract. Red blood cells in the urine could also mean that you may have a kidney stone or something like that. And then bile, if you have bile in the urine, then that may point to that you have liver disease, which is also a problem. So this is why when you go into the doctor, they're going to test your urine. They're going to look for these substances in the urine and figure out if you have some sort of problem that needs to be fixed. So once that urine is produced from the kidneys, it is going to run down the ureters. The ureters, again, are these slender tubes that come off of the kidney and will move down and go into and empty into the urinary bladder. And it's basically one continuous system as you're moving from the kidneys down the ureters and into the urinary bladder. They flow behind the peritoneum, and they actually do have muscular walls, and they help push the urine down into the urinary bladder. It seems like gravity would be able to do this job just fine, but peristalsis, the contraction of the smooth muscle, we saw this in the digestive system as well. So the smooth muscle lining the walls of the ureter will help squeeze that urine and empty it down into the urinary bladder. Then we come to this urinary bladder, this organ down at the bottom. This is a very muscular sac, and this is where our urine is temporarily stored before we have icterition, which is the voiding of the urinary bladder, basically. Let's go down and look at this next slide where we can see a close-up of the urinary bladder. You can see the ureters coming in on the back side here, coming from the kidneys, dumping down into the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder has 3 openings. You have the 2 openings where the ureters are emptying into the urinary bladder, and then you have the opening that's going to move down into the urethra, where the urine is going to be voided from the body. This area here, because it makes sort of a triangular area here, this is called the trigone. And this is where infections often happen or persist, and so it's important to physicians. And then also the prostate gland in the males is located right around, it surrounds the opening here, moving into the urethra. And so that becomes important when you're talking about, for example, if the prostate gland starts to enlarge, if you have an enlarged prostate gland, that can affect your ability to void your urinary bladder, because it'll put pressure here and close up that opening. So that can be a problem as well. The urinary bladder wall is also special because it has a special type of tissue called transitional epithelium. And we saw this clear back at the beginning of the class, as we talked about the different types of tissue. This is a type of epithelium. We've seen other epitheliums such as simple squamous and things like that. The special thing about transitional, it's basically only found in the urinary bladder inside the body. What it does is the cells are situated so that they can expand, they can stretch, change shape, I guess is a better way to think about it. They change shape to allow for the extension of the urinary bladder, so it can basically get bigger. So as the urine is coming in, it can expand and increase the amount of urine it can hold. Once micturition has happened, then it can go back to its original side. And here you can see a slide showing the distension of the urinary bladder. So it has a potential to become quite large. Normally, if it doesn't have any urine inside, then it's about 2 to 3 inches long, not very big at all. But as it fills up, if it's moderately full, it'll be about 6 inches long, cold up to maybe 600 milliliters of urine, but it can hold up to twice that much. So it can hold almost a liter of urine. At that point, though, it's going to be quite distended, and you may even be able to feel that hardened urinary bladder just above the pelvic bone. So it can get quite large, and again, that's because of the transitional epithelial cells that surround or make up the walls of the urinary bladder. And then finally, we have the urethra, which is this little tube down at the end here. This does variance in length. So in females, it's very short, maybe 3 to 4 inches. In males, is much longer because it goes from urinary bladder and goes through the penis, and so it's much longer there. Can be up to 8 inches long. Actually, let me fix that. I said 3 to 4 inches. I meant in females 3 to 4 centimeters, or just over maybe an inch and a half is how long the urethra would be in females. In females, it is only for voiding the urine, but in males, it's a common pathway for both for the urine and then also for the release of sperm from the body as well. The urethra has 2 sphincters, so in order to void the urine, there's 2 sphincters that come into play here. We have the internal urethral sphincter, and then we have the external urethral sphincter, and both come into play in the voiding of the urine. So the internal urethral sphincter, this is smooth muscle. What this means is that this is involuntary control. So what happens here is that urinary bladder begins to fill, the internal urethral sphincter will relax and open, and that's when you get the feeling that you need to go and use the restroom, basically. And that is, again, that's involuntary. At that point, you can decide if you can go to the bathroom right then you can go and follow that prompting, I guess. But if it's inconvenient, then you can kind of ignore it, and at that point it will contract back, and then it'll continue to fill up the urinary bladder, and then again, a little bit later, it'll open again, and then you'll feel that feeling that you need to go. And again, even though it's involuntary, you still have control, because the external urethral sphincter, this is the voluntary, this is skeletal muscle, and so you have voluntary control of this, and this is why you can decide when you want to void the urine. So the involuntary says, oh, it's time to void. You say, not yet. Then it'll come back, say, time to void. You'll say, okay. And then at that point, then you will consciously relax the external sphincter, and then you'll be able to void the urine. This only works to a certain extent, though. So the involuntary, it gives you a chance, but if you wait so long, eventually you lose the voluntary control. So you can't hold it forever. At some point, you're going to lose that control. So you have to use that function wisely. Let's continue on here and talk about now the homeostatic mechanism of the kidneys, of the urinary system. So urinary system is important in fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. Right now we're going to talk about the fluid and electrolyte, and then in a later section we'll talk about the acid-base balance. So your blood composition depends on 3 factors: your diet, your cellular metabolism, and your urine output. All these things come together to build the composition of your blood. And so the kidneys have some roles in maintaining that blood composition. We've already talked about the first one, which is excretion of nitrogenous-containing waste, which are the result of, again, of amino acid metabolism. And so we have to get rid of those that are toxic to our body. We have to get rid of those nitrogen-containing wastes, and so it does that. Then next of all, we have to maintain the water balance of the blood. And then also the electrolyte balance of the blood, so the ions, the potassium, the sodium, the ions that are floating in the blood, and then ensuring this proper blood pH, which is the acid-base balance. So we've already talked about this one. Now we're going to talk about this one and this one together, and then third of all we'll talk about this one here. The electrolyte balance is very important because electrolytes are related to the osmotic regulation, because salts are followed by water. So wherever the salts go, the water will follow soon after. And so this is important because this can affect blood pressure and things of that sort. So if you're maintaining a lot of ions in the blood, then the water is going to stay in the blood. If you're excreting ions in the urine, the water is going to follow that and be excreted in the urine. So this helps us maintain blood pressure and the composition of the blood. As far as water is concerned, we are mostly water. There's a lot of water in our body. It varies between males and females. Females are usually young adult females, about 50% water. Males are about 60%. Babies are the most. They have a ton of water, 75% water. And so as a baby you have 75%. As a young adult you're down to 60 or 50%. Then by the time you get old you're starting to dry out and you become 45% water. Not a lot of water left. And so we have to maintain, water is very important, so we have to maintain a certain water balance inside our body. There's basically three places you find water inside the body. The first is called the intracellular fluid. And this is microscopic inside the cells. So when you get down inside each of our cells, here's our cell, it's got a nucleus here, and then we have all this area inside the cell. It's a fluid inside. So this is called intracellular fluid of the cell. That's about 2/3 of the body fluid. Then we have extracellular fluid, which is the fluid all around the cells. So you may have, well, you have billions of cells, and around these cells you have this fluid that surrounds them. That's the extracellular fluid. And this includes the interstitial fluid and the blood plasma as well. So those are the three places: intracellular fluid, and then the extracellular fluid is made up of the interstitial fluid and the blood plasma. The blood plasma is the fluid inside the blood. Interstitial fluid is this fluid around the cells. Here. So extracellular fluid, interstitial, and then blood plasma found inside the blood. So it splits up kind of like this. So if we're 60% of our body is water, then of that 40%, not 40% of the 60%, but 40% of this total 60% is going to be the intracellular fluid. And then of the 20% that's left, 20% of the rest of that, 80% of the 20% is going to be interstitial, and then just 20% of that 20% is going to be the plasma volume. And so together this makes up our total water balance inside our body. So as humans we have this requirement to take in water, and we're also losing water. And so we have to balance the water input and output inside our body to maintain that 60% of our body weight being water, because we're losing water every day. And these are some of the ways that we're losing water. So sweat, about 8% of the water that we lose every day is lost through sweat, and that's important in maintaining homeostasis. Then also 28% of all the water that we lose every day is just lost through our skin and through our lungs. So as we're breathing, remember, as the air is coming inside our lungs, we're moistening that air. So when we're breathing out moist air. That's why when you go outside on a cold day and you breathe out, you see that cloud. That's because your breath is moist, and so you're losing air, you're losing water in that way. The feces have just a little bit of water, so a lot of that water is reabsorbed in the large intestine, which is its function, but you still need a little bit of water in order to help the feces move along and be ejected from the digestive system. And then finally, the urine, you lose about 60% of the water each day in the urine. And so we have to be bringing water in as well to balance this water loss. We do get some water from metabolism. That's simply just from the fact when we're eating, as we're breaking chemical bonds, we're releasing water. And that happens. So we get some of our water just from the food we eat. And it's interesting because some organisms, they get all the water they need from metabolism and from the foods they eat. So we get 10 and we get about 40%. So some organisms, especially in desert climates, so if you're living in Sierra Vista, Arizona, like I am, then you're living in somewhat of a desert climate, and so there's a lot of animals that are adapted to get all the water they need, all that water intake just from the food and their metabolism, so they don't have to drink water every day. But we, as humans, we have to get some water every day through actual drinking water or other beverages. So, and notice how these things equal up. So if we're getting more water in, then we're going to be outputting more water. So we have to keep this in balance. If we're getting less water in, then we're going to be losing less water. So that all makes sense. So that's going to determine, and I guess the reason this is important is because this is the main place where that's going to fluctuate. That's where this homeostasis comes into play. So feces are always going to be about 4%. Sweat, you're not really going to adjust that much. And the lungs and the skin, you're not going to adjust that. But the urine output can be adjusted. So if you're taking in less water, then your urine is going to be more concentrated. There's going to be less water in the urine. If you're bringing in a lot of water, then your urine is going to be more dilute. And so that's where this homeostatic regulation comes in. It's controlled by hormones. Some of these we've seen before. There's the antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and this prevents excessive water loss. So as this hormone is released, it causes water to be reabsorbed in the kidneys, and now we've seen where this happens. Before we talked about the endocrine system, we talked about ADH, but we didn't know at that point where this is actually going on. But this is in the kidneys collecting ducts, cause it to reabsorb more water. And diabetes insipidus, not to be confused with diabetes mellitus, which is the glucose disorder. Diabetes insipidus is when you're losing too much water. So this is when antidiuretic hormone is not released, and so you end up letting go of a lot of urine. It's very dilute. You're losing too much water. Then there's also aldosterone, and this is a hormone that causes sodium to be reabsorbed as well. So sodium is important because it's thinking about salt. Sodium chloride is salt, and so sodium, if you're reabsorbing sodium, remember that water follows salt. So as sodium is being reabsorbed, water is being reabsorbed as well. It's going to make more concentrated urine through the functions of aldosterone. And then finally, there's the renin-angiotensin mechanism. And this is carried out by the juxtaglomerular apparatus of the renal tubules. And if the blood pressure is low, then that stimulates the JG, juxtaglomerular apparatus, to release the hormone renin. It's released into the blood. That produces angiotensin II, and then this angiotensin II causes vasoconstriction and aldosterone release, and then that aldosterone release causes sodium to be reabsorbed, which causes the water to be reabsorbed, which increases the blood volume as you're adding water to it, and therefore the blood pressure. So the renin-angiotensin mechanism is a blood pressure homeostatic mechanism.